Hello, everyone. I am Rodrigo Silva, Communications Manager at Cogitatium. I welcome you all to today's webinar that will explore how the COP26 conference in Glasgow impacts the European Green Deal and European Union's climate policy for the future. With this discussion, we are launching also our thematic issue, Climate Governance and European Green Deal in Turbulent Times, published very recently in our open access journal, Politics and Governance. I will soon share the link in the chat. As such, let me introduce today's panel, composed of Diarmuid Torney from Dublin City University. He is the co-editor of this issue. So the other co-editor is Claire Dupont. Jana Gheuens from Vrije Universiteit Brussel, and Joseph Earsom from the University of Louvain. Both are authors of this issue. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Sharon Turner, today's discussant. Sharon is an expert consultant to the European Climate Foundation and visiting professor at the University of Sussex. I'd like to thank all the speakers for their presence here today. To our audience, allow me to provide you all with a little bit more information concerning today's event. As you can see, this will be the order of presentations, okay? After all the presentations, we will have a final discussion among all speakers and potentially with your help with the questions that you might write throughout the whole session on the Q&A format on the bottom of your screen. Okay, please indicate the name to whom you are writing the question, and in the end, we'll assign that question to the speaker. Also, if you're on Twitter, we invite you to follow Politics and Governance Twitter page, to be in touch with our publications, our calls, our events, the impact of our research. So we invite you also to follow our Twitter account. Without further delay, I will now pass the word to Diarmuid, and I wish you all a very pleasant webinar. Thank you.
Rodrigo, thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you to all of the audience for joining. As Rodrigo said, I am one of the co-editors of the special issue of the Journal of Politics and Governance that we are launching today. And I'm speaking on my own behalf, and also on behalf of my co-editor of the special issue, Dr. Claire Dupont of Ghent University. So our task today really is twofold. It is to launch and mark the publication of that special issue, but it's also to do so in the light of the recently concluded COP26 climate change conference. And when we were discussing the possibility of a launch webinar a couple of months ago, we identified this moment, this post COP26 moment, as the ideal opportunity to launch the special issue and to reflect on the findings of the special issue in light of what has taken place, the outcomes of COP26. And so in my remarks, I hope to give you both a flavour of the special issue and our findings, and also to link that to the outcomes of COP26, to reflect on those outcomes and to point to future directions for policy and for research. So the special issue, I'll start off with that, is an output of a Jean Monnet network called Governing the EU's Climate and Energy Transition in Turbulent Times, or GovTran for short. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the contributions of all of the contributors to the special issue. We will be hearing from two of them shortly, but also there's a wider group of contributors, and I'd like to acknowledge their contribution. In the special issue, we were interested to understand the origins, form, development and scope of the European Green Deal and its policy areas, and we wanted to explore the utility of the concept of turbulence to assess the emergence of the European Green Deal and the policy and governance choices associated with it. So what do we mean by turbulence? Turbulence is sometimes used, or sometimes thought of as a synonym for crisis, but in fact the two terms are not identical. While crisis occurs suddenly or unexpectedly, turbulence refers rather to the shifting ground upon which governance actions occur, leading to choices between governing with or against turbulence. And the special issue provides an opportunity to engage with this concept of turbulence. It tries to do so by looking at a wide range of perspectives on the European Green Deal. And I want to just give one sentence on each of the contributions to whet your appetite for the contents of the special issue. So if any of the following topics are of interest, I'd encourage you to engage with the articles. So the special issue opens with a contribution from Mary Dobbs, Vivian Grave, and Ludivine Petitin, who provide a detailed conceptual discussion of turbulence and its potential application to analysing EU climate and environmental governance. And that really sets the scene for the contributions in the rest of the special issue. Marco Sidi analyses negotiations on the European climate law, which is now in place, and on the 2030 EU target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Jana Gheuens and Sebastian Obertur, who you'll be hearing from Jana shortly, ask how much the EU has integrated a long-term view into its climate and energy policy and ambition. Jeff Rosamond and Claire Dupont, my co-editor of the special issue, explore the European Council and the Council of Ministers and how they have responded to the emergence and development of the European Green Deal. Odysseus Christou investigates the evolution of the conceptualization of energy security in EU policy since 1995. Jonas Schoenefeld focuses on policy monitoring and emphasizes the political nature of monitoring choices. He underlines the need to understand better the effects of monitoring in the context of the European Green Deal. My own contribution to the special issue examines the use of innovative forms of deliberative democracy in governing the response to climate change, which are an increasingly prominent feature of the European Green Deal. Katja Wiedenhoff looks at the case of Poland, which stands out as a member state which has most vehemently opposed numerous decisions on increasing the EU's level of ambition. And last but not least, and you'll be hearing from him shortly, Joseph Earsom and his colleague Tom Delreux focus on the international dimension of EU climate policy, looking in particular at the international negotiations on international shipping and emissions from international shipping. So I hope that's given you a sense of the diverse topics that we focus on in the special issue. And as a whole, I think the contributions demonstrate that while specifying the contextual factors, researching the sources of and responses to turbulence provides useful insights into the development direction and potential durability of EU climate governance. And so, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this moment provides an opportunity for us to reflect, to build on those insights from the special issue and to reflect on the outcomes of COP26, which concluded on Saturday evening. And as I'm sure you're aware, it has attracted a lot of attention, and indeed much has been said in the days since the COP26 conference drew to a close, with many pointing to its failures, but many others focusing on its achievements. And so there's a kind of a divergence of views on what was achieved at COP26. And on the one hand, if we ask the question, was the outcome enough? Was it sufficient to bend the emissions curve to put us on a trajectory to 1.5 degrees? I think by any objective measure, the answer to that question has to be no. It hasn't gone far enough. What the conference did was to lay bare the gap between the transformational change required and the current level of ambition embodied in the collective pledges by the 197 parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. But on the other hand, COP26 made important progress and set a framework for strengthening the global response to climate change over the coming year before COP27, but also further into the future. The central output of COP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact, provides a particular framework for countries to strengthen their pledges before next year's COP. And that's a key change from the Paris Agreement of 2015, because it asks countries to come back to the table, to come back to COP next year with updated and strengthened national climate pledges, or nationally determined contributions in the climate change jargon. That framework is anchored in a strong endorsement of the latest IPCC report, and anchored in the 1.5 degree, the lower of the two temperature goals in the Paris Agreement. And there's also a reference to the need to reduce global CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030 relative to 2010 levels, and to net zero around mid-century. And the recognition of all of that is important, because with those written into the Glasgow Climate Pact, those will be the benchmarks against which updated and strengthened national climate pledges are assessed a year from now and into the future. There's also a very well documented reference to coal and to fossil fuel subsidies. It's the first reference to coal in a document of its kind. It's also been well documented that those references were progressively weakened over the course of the negotiations in the second week. But notwithstanding that weakening, the language still sends a clear message to the global economy about the phase out or phase down of fossil fuels. And although the language was watered down, I think the direction of travel is clear. The direction of travel away from fossil fuels is clear. And I think that's been evident in some of the market signals that have come out since, a decline in coal stocks. COP26 also finalized the so-called Paris Rulebook, the detailed set of rules to implement the Paris Agreement. So those were 6 years in negotiations, and that's finally completed now, allowing countries to move forward. Other aspects of the negotiations of particular concern to developing and vulnerable countries, such as loss and damage and climate finance. Those outcomes failed to satisfy the demands of those countries on the front line of climate change. Some progress was recorded, but a lot remains to be done on those items of the agenda. So what are the next steps and implications for the EU arising from COP26 and for the European Green Deal if we reflect on the findings of our special issue? Well, there's no doubt that more ambition is required individually and collectively from the countries of the world who need to do more on mitigation, on finance. More work is required on climate finance, on loss and damage, and on a range of other issues. The EU has a key role to play in these areas. In the international negotiations, but also at home domestically within the EU, because ambition on its own will not cut it. We need rapid implementation of ambitious targets. Commitments announced in the glare of the global media at an annual conference of the parties are only really meaningful if they're put into action. And so we need strong delivery mechanisms. The European Climate Law, which is covered in our special issue in Marco City's contribution, is an important step, but we need full delivery of the aims and ambitions of the European Green Deal agenda across the wide spectrum of policy arenas across which the European Green Deal cuts. And of course, all of this needs to be done against a backdrop of a turbulent governance landscape, both within the EU and globally. And this brings us back to the themes and insights of the special issue. I think it's fair to say that turbulence is here to say we're in a new and challenging world. And those challenges open up new avenues for research and for practice. We need to better understand how turbulence shapes the evolution of the European Green Deal. We also need to investigate how the turbulence of global politics shapes the opportunities and constraints on the EU engagement in international climate diplomacy. And we also need to understand, if you like, the mirror image of that, how the European Green Deal and the climate transition are a cause of turbulence, not just a response to turbulence. And as we reflect on COP26 and how to move forward, therefore, I think there's a lot that remains to be done, both by researchers and practitioners. And we hope that the special issue that we're marking the publication of today goes some way to contributing to that understanding, but much remains to be done. So Rodrigo, I'll hand back to you at this stage.
Thank you, Diarmuid, for the kickoff, a good context of the issue and the topic around. We'll now be hearing from our authors and their research, starting by Jana Gheuens, please.
Yeah, also from me, thank you, Diarmuid, for your overview of the special issue and for your comprehensive assessment of COP26. So for the special issue, I co-authored a paper with Sebastian Oberter that examines the short-sightedness of EU climate and energy policy. More specifically, it looks at the 2020 package that set a target of 20% emission reduction by 2020, the 2030 framework that set a 40% emission reduction by 2030, and then also the climate law in the context of the European Green Deal that sets a 55% target by 2030 as well. This paper was kind of born out of this idea that it's often said that democracies and policymakers are not equipped to deal with climate change and climate change crisis, as they are too short-sighted or short-term focused. A lot of the times then studies jump into solutions to overcome the short-sightedness by arguing for different forms of democracies, like more deliberative democracies, or even getting rid of democracy at all. For me, I always felt that, okay, but what do we actually mean when we talk about short-sightedness? And is this really true that democracies are not equipped to deal with this at all? So as a first step, we looked into what do we then actually define as short-sightedness. Already intuitively, you feel that it is not enough to say you will do something in the future, you know, like we now see with COP26 as well. There are pledges being made by 2050, we will be at net zero, or by 2070, we will do this. But as long as there's no more near-term substance in it, this kind of falls short of what we consider to be a long-term focus policy. So then we derived a measurement tool that is based on 4 criteria. The first one is measuring the efforts that the policy makes. So for this, we compare how much a policy advances a baseline scenario, so the emissions that would have happened if there were no existing policies, towards what we see as scientifically required to limit global warming to, for example, 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, as are the Paris Agreement's goals. Then secondly, something that Diarmuid also said, it is not enough to only set this ambition, it also needs to be reached and maintained over time. So we also look at the stringency of a policy. Then, as we see that climate policies are generally insufficient to meet these targets, we also include an element of adaptability, that legislation needs to be regularly reviewed over time and upwardly revised. Here, the Paris Agreement and COP26 is of course very relevant as well. As you might know, now in the COP26, this was the first time that all the countries did some kind of global stock take together where they assess this progress. So that's an element that's obviously been very influenced by this development on the international scene. And then finally, we'll look at, did the policymakers actually try, had the intention to have a long-term focus policy? Are there any long-term objectives included in the legislation? And do they specify a pathway to get there from the near term to the future? So do they say only by 2050, or do they then specify kind of a trajectory how to get to net zero by 2050? As a result, we found that even though the European Green Deal and the climate law, its 55% target, they are often posited by this radical transformation of EU climate and energy policy, or this return to European leadership by the Commission itself. We see that actually at best, it has the same level of short-sightedness of the 20% by 2020 targets. Especially if we consider that this 55% is a net target, meaning that negative emissions are also included in it. It is not only emission cuts, and that now this 1.5 degree warming has become more prominent on the international arena. We see that actually the European Green Deal might only be at the same level of the 2030 framework rather than improving on it. Then when we look at the stringency, it's difficult to really see this for the European Green Deal, as most of the implementing legislation is still being negotiated at the moment in the Fit for 55 package. So it will be interesting to see here which kind of provisions are in this legislation to then actually meet the 55% target. You know, seeing, for example, what is the renewable energy target? Will this be binding at a national level or at a union level? What are the provisions for energy efficiency? All of these things can, of course, help reaching the targets or not. So that remains to be seen at this point. Then when it comes to adaptability, as I already said before, we see kind of a strengthening of this adaptability as well, especially after the Paris Agreement. And now with the climate law, this has become even more strengthened because of the establishment of a European Scientific Advisory Board that helps to integrate more of the science into these revisions. And then also by some provisions on a 2040 target that can then also lead to, you know, more regular revisions and more regular pathway towards 2050. Then finally, we also saw an increase in long-term thinking. This really culminated in the climate law here as well, as the climate neutrality by 2050 is really the central objective of this piece of legislation. So we see that this long-term thinking also become more and more prominent. However, what is missing here still a little bit is some more scientific explanation of where this net zero target comes from. There are some studies that argue that the EU should already reach net zero by, for example, 2040 or earlier. And also it doesn't really specify the trajectory that the EU will take, which is still very important to be included as well. So to kind of conclude all of these results, we see that the reality is more nuanced than saying that all policymakers are just short-sighted, but that there really is some variation over time as well between the different packages, that some are more short or far-sighted than others. This then begs the question, what are some of the elements that lead to more short-sighted or to more far-sighted policy, to then see how can we perhaps adapt our institutions that more of these far-sighted elements gain more prominence, so that we can then also have stronger policies. Secondly, this is now for the overall targets. I think it will also be interesting to see how this will be present in more sectoral policies, like, for example, buildings or cars, which you might expect more resistance there, as of course the costs of climate mitigation will become more possible. So I think that's also a very interesting avenue of research to explore in the future. I will leave it at this, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Jana, for your presentation. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. And I actually have some slides, so I will try to share them right now. And we should be good to go. If I could just get to Rodrigo, yes. Is that? Yes. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so first of all, thanks very much, not only to Politics and Governance, and to Rodrigo for organizing this webinar, but of course to Diarmuid and Claire for organizing this special issue. It's exciting to be a part of and kind of see the fruits of it. On behalf of myself and my co-author, Tom Delra. So what am I going to talk about here, and kind of why should we care? Why does it fit with the European Green Deal? So right here with our paper, we were looking at the EU's goal achievement at the IMO initial strategy. And first of all, well, what is the IMO and what does it have to do with climate change and the Green Deal? Well, the International Maritime Organization is actually it's a UN agency, and it's actually the competent authority via the Kyoto Protocol and its own internal mandate for regulating greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, which has been something that's figured into EU climate ambition for some time, and there's been finally some movement on it with the Green Deal, and I'll get to that in a second. But the interesting thing about the IMO is it's an international body, but progress has been quite slow moving over the past decades on climate change. There's an interesting power dynamic there where the IMO, unlike UNFCCC, where we have CBD, RRC and all of that, in the IMO, there's this power dynamic where there's no more favorable treatment. So there's no discrimination based on where a different shipping vessel is registered. So countries have a lot of discretion and moving around the world. So we have these big players like Liberia, Panama, and the Marshall Islands in the IMO, who normally would be very small players on an international geopolitical scale, but they have such large shipping registries that they're actually very key actors in regulating international maritime transports. And these states also have very close ties to industry, so industry is quite powerful within the IMO. But in 2018, kind of 2 years after the Paris Agreement, we do have this IMO initial strategy on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in shipping, which you can see on the screen. Basically, the key things are reducing carbon intensity up to 70% by 2050, and then peaking total greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible with a 50% reduction by 2050. So kind of the puzzle, the point of departure here was the EU as an international climate leader has long called for action on emissions reductions in IMO, starting in 2003 as early. And we see that the international initial strategy for greenhouse gas reduction actually satisfied that EU's overarching objective for action. And then we see some interesting quotes coming out at that time from then Commissioner Arias Cañete and Violeta Bulc on the role of the EU in negotiations, saying, hey, the EU and its member states played a really instrumental role in brokering and securing this outcome. It's another strong example of the EU as a post-Paris champion. We're a strong actor and whatnot. However, there's a lot of different things that call into question the extent that the EU actually was involved in the negotiations. First of all, the EU is not actually a member of the IMO. The Commission has an observership, nor does it actually, up until now in the Green Deal, and I'll get to that in a second, have expressed competence on greenhouse gas emissions in international shipping. So this means the European Union as such, as a bloc, is relatively restricted in negotiations. And then also some really interesting research came out from Jack Corbett and an article in Environmental Politics on how the role of small island developing states in negotiations. So all of this calls into effect the impact of the EU in these negotiations. So what Tom and I tried to do was really unpack what was going on there and what could this tell us about the Green Deal? Well, implications for the Green Deal is we of course see the recent legislative proposal to include shipping emissions in the ETS that the Commission launched back in July. So our hope was that the findings of the initial strategy and what made it to be successful, so how the EU was actually able to achieve its objectives there, could help frame the challenges and opportunities facing the European Green Deal with shipping. And then not just also following with COP26, which I'll get to at the end of the presentation. So that was really our point of departure. So what we did very briefly, just looking at this, how did the EU achieve its goal? From a different perspective of, it's not so much what did the EU do, but we call into question what the EU actually did. We worked backwards from it achieving its goal to kind of see the steps and explain what happened there. So we use something called the explaining outcome variant of process tracing to do so. And I'll demonstrate that within the next slide as we craft what we call a causal mechanism. I won't get too much into the details, but it's just a good visualization. So how the EU actually ended up with a favorable outcome. So we find that there are actually three particular causes that triggered the way that the EU was able to actually achieve the outcome. So triggering the process that took place. They were all necessary. Without the combination of the three of them, the EU would not have achieved its objectives. Then we see this link of 5 chains. So the outcome is that reduction target, what the EU wanted. It's that operationalization of the longstanding goal in the negotiations and the IMO. So we start with the EU, of course, has longstanding chose action on greenhouse gas reduction in the IMO, going back to 2003. The IMO has been the place for greenhouse gas reductions. The EU has continually mentioned that over and over again. However, this alone by itself was not sufficient. Otherwise, the EU logically would have achieved its goal earlier. Second, we see this motivated entrepreneur with similar objectives as the European Union. So what's really interesting is at this time, something that came up again and again, the Marshall Islands, that small island developing state in the Pacific, which has a long history as a particular shipping actor in industry and even represented very much by shipping interests in the IMO, had a big pivot in 2015 when part of their foreign minister, Tony de Bruym, attended IMO meetings calling for shipping to do its fair share and take action on greenhouse gas reduction. So this was taken as a big surprise within the shipping community. And also from that time, we see momentum building for action at the IMO. The Paris Agreement in 2015, and then the sea change, if you'll pardon the pun, ramping up the pressure for something to happen at all levels, just IMO member states, the Secretariat, and different actors not wanting to look at the bad guys. So from there, we see all these things coming together, and there's now the causal mechanism, this link is triggered, and the process goes forward. We see the Marshall Islands actually reaching out to European Union member states starting in 2015 with the help of some academics from University College London, University of South Pacific, reaching out to Belgium, France, Germany, the Netherlands. These EU institutional actors, not the EU as a whole, but particular member states with the help of the Commission, respond favorably and form something called the Shipping High Ambition Coalition. So you've probably heard of the High Ambition Coalition and the UNFCCC. We had here a separate Shipping High Ambition Coalition. And basically what happened there was the ambiguity of EU competence on greenhouse gas emissions in shipping and the strong state level history of action in the IMO meant that the EU institutional actors had some leeway to join this coalition. And on the EU side, this coalition eventually ended up including pretty much every member state except Cyprus, Malta, and Greece. But this kind of key coordination ended up taking place outside of the EU context with the Marshall Islands. And from there, the SHAC works together to lay the groundwork for an ambitious reduction targets and to figure out what a fair share of shipping for the Paris Agreement as far as greenhouse gas reduction would look like, doing some outreach activity and whatnot. This was notably the case with France and the One Planet Summit in 2016, and the Tony de Bruym, where they made a declaration trying to bring up to the political level to get people to have the attention in shipping. And then from there, we see later in the process, kind of 2018, moving towards the negotiations, EU gets a very coordinated position on the negotiations and builds from there in the shipping working party of the transport configuration of the council. And within this EU dynamic, there were very divergent positions. Some countries with heavy shipping interests hesitant to go out on a limb. The presidency, which was Estonia, thus tried to work very hard to get coordination and created a dynamic that was both open-ended, but with ambitious language at the same time. And this all fed back into kind of an EU outreach program that started at that moment. And then from there, we really see late in the game, the EU starting to drive negotiations with bilateral outreach being persuasive, sending the commissioner and the parliamentary delegation, and applying institutional pressure at the final endgame of the negotiations in April 2018, where the objective was reached. So kind of just a brief overview of the research here is we see something where it's not a traditional expectation of the EU acting and then achieving its objectives. It's really, without these favorable circumstances, the EU having a coalition partner and momentum, the EU would not have achieved its goals. So kind of calls into question the extent the EU is a cohesive leader outside the UNFCCC. Framing this within the European Green Deal, we see several proposals, including measures relating to shipping, but most relevant is shipping in the ETS. From the EU, the Commission's impact assessment and proposal, we see that there's very much a keen interest to use ETS as a way of bringing together change at the international level. At the same time, this ETS inclusion appears to be a threat. Well, if you don't do something, the EU is going to do a cap and trade on emissions within shipping to spur action. As far as lessons learned from the case study, well, we see that the EU really does have a successful history of using unilateral action in the IMO on environmental issues to drive upon shipping, to drive to action, but it really was not the case in our case study. And we'll also note that EU action was only one of the causes that triggered the mechanism. If the EU wants more ambitious action in the IMO, it really should look for international partners. And finally, this kind of ambiguous competence in the IMO seemed to paradoxically contribute to the EU's success there. ETS inclusion would make it a union competence, which could really jeopardize that and infuse kind of horizontal turbulence. Really briefly, concluding to frame findings within COP26, it's really a big month we see for greening shipping. We of course first had COP26, but there also is a meeting of the IMO's Marine Protection Committee that's meeting next week. So there's action really on a 2050 pledge, on a net zero for international shipping, and maybe a global carbon levy. If we look at all the case from our case study, a lot of elements are there to inspire international action. Of course, the EU has still remained very motivated to drive decarbonizing shipping in the sector with the European Green Deal proposal. But at COP26, we also saw two really interesting proposals. A coalition for net zero by 2050 by a scheme of different actors, including several European states and the US. And then also something called the Clydebank Declaration, which is talking about green shipping lanes. So we're seeing really a big push for international action that's going to build pressure. Also a very ambitious tone from the IMO Secretariat that hasn't been there before. What's interesting is it's a very familiar cast of characters from the shack with the addition of the US, but the EU has been quite absent from both of those declarations, which could then go be issues about a potential competence in looking at some official documents in the shipping heavy member states not being interested. So what we're seeing here is there's a lot of political momentum brewing for change in international shipping, and hopefully we'll see something next week in London. But the EU unilateral action is going to be just one part of that. It's not going to be an action all by itself. It's one part of the broader piece, one brick in the wall. So with that, I know I've gone a bit over, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you, Joseph, for your presentation, as well, Jana, for presenting both of you your research. For a comment on the issue now, the articles and on the topic in general being discussed here, we'll now be hearing from Sharon Turner. Sharon.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the authors for inviting me to speak. I must say, it was absolutely fascinating to read the collection, and I hope I'm going to give an apology immediately to Joseph by saying that I'm going to focus most of my responses on the Green Deal and the turbulence question and long-term governance, which is the most direct relationship to the work I do. But so my apologies in advance, but still very, very, I mean, I think that the collection is incredibly well timed and is incredibly thought-provoking, and I think a really helpful contribution to people like myself who work in the world of practice. And in some respects, I think I'm going to be challenged to try to keep the time here because there are so many, I think, interesting reflections for me in terms of what you've published and what you're saying, and in terms of the forward research agenda for all of this. And I think by way of introduction, I'll just say a few brief words about myself and the world I have been working in. Like yourselves, I spent most of my career as an academic. I was a professor of environmental law in Queen's University in Belfast for many years, and I focused very much on governance, climate governance and law there. But for the last decade, essentially for the period spanning the period of the EU's third package right to the present, I have been working with the European Climate Foundation, first as a member of staff and then as an independent consultant guiding their strategy. And my role there was, first of all, to set up their climate governance programme, and now more laterally to continue to advise them on the strategy. And for members of the audience who don't know who the European Climate Foundation is, it's a strategic grant maker on climate change, and they work in extremely close collaboration with a huge range of partners across Europe and across the world. And my role was to co-create with civil society a strategy for winning, and well, for first of all, deciding what were the arrangements for climate governance we wanted to win, and then how we were going to go about doing so, both at the EU level and at the national level. And from the very outset, the central objective of the programme, and it remains the programme's objective, although to some extent we've made significant strides towards it, but our central objective was to make the case for processes that established long-term climate governance at the European and national level. Our very long-term objective at that time when I first started was effectively to win a climate law for the EU, and also to campaign for the adoption of similar long-term policy frameworks, long-term policy management frameworks in countries across Europe and further afield. And the strategy was based on our understanding that long-term climate governance processes play a crucial role in creating the enabling conditions for raising climate ambition and also for ensuring policy consistency with science. Now, obviously, we acknowledged very much the role of other drivers in achieving those outcomes, but we saw long-term governance in particular as playing a distinctive role in stabilizing and fostering political leadership, building public consent, and driving ambition. And we also, I think at that stage, calculated and assumed that the journey towards the long-term scientific climate objective was always going to be turbulent. We didn't, in a sense, necessarily anticipate just quite how turbulent, but we certainly factored in turbulence and saw long-term approaches to climate policy making as being absolutely crucial to enable policymakers to work with turbulence. And I think that was a very interesting part of your own research in terms of these sorts of questions, in terms of how do you work against turbulence or with turbulence? And our approach would be very much to see long-term approaches to climate governance as being necessary to help policymakers almost to transcend and assume turbulence, but to continue making the decisions that need to be made. And while all of that, I mean, when I sit here saying this now, that all seemed, today it seems like quite a sensible approach to take, given, I suppose, what has happened since then. But when I began this work in the field of practice, the emphasis on long-term climate governance was actually greeted with considerable hostility, and in particular was greeted with hostility within the European Commission, who essentially accused us of destabilizing or risking near-term ambition by also calling for a longer-term focus. And happily, the European Climate Foundation continued to support the work, so we carried on with the work. But we were also incredibly fortunate to have partners who were willing to work incredibly closely with us, think tanks and civil society actors. But we were very much, in the early days, we were very much reinforced by the signing of the Paris Agreement, because it clarified the long-term objective, but also importantly, it emphasized the importance of long-term climate strategies from the parties. And we were also, I think, emboldened by the fact that over time, we could see that numerous countries across Europe and across the world were coming to the same conclusion. They were also beginning to conclude that if we want to do the right thing on climate, if we want to be scientifically credible on climate, we do in fact need to adopt a long-term approach to national climate governance. But in terms of reflecting more specifically on the papers, I'd just make a number of comments. I suppose, first of all, it was interesting reading Sebastian's paper and Sebastian and Jana's paper on myopia in European climate policy. And to some extent, it was almost like a walk down memory lane, reflecting on the evolutions that have occurred in the course of my time in practice. But your paper also was, I think, a very strong reminder to me that we have an awful lot to achieve yet if we're going to stabilize and consolidate this focus on long-term governance, both at the EU level and within member states. And it also, I think, reinforced my conviction that the Fit for 55 package is now a crucial turning point in that process. And if we don't make progress in consolidating long-term approaches at the EU and national level, then I think Europe's capacity to achieve climate neutrality is in peril, or it's certainly facing a much more risky future. But it also very much reminded me and reinforced me, if it ever needed to be done, that we will need in the world of practice the full support of the academic research community to unpack the options for how long-term climate governance can be designed and supported. But I was also struck by what seemed like two interesting gaps in your examination of the drivers for the European Green Deal. And this is, in a sense, me applying a very different lens to the events of that time. On the one hand, it seems to me that you don't fully, I think, see the link between the governance regulation, what was established in the governance regulation during the third package, and the launch of the European Green Deal itself. And also, I think that the collection, I mean, I understand very much as a former academic that academic research will tend to rely on the formal sources. But I think what the collection maybe doesn't entirely capture was the crucial role that civil society played and think tanks in laying the ground for the European Green Deal, which was in fact enormous. And I think that filling those gaps in the research matters because it will create a much more holistic understanding of the drivers for commitments to long-term governance, but it also demonstrates, it'll help to demonstrate why long-term governance processes actually matter. And to very quickly fill in some of those gaps, I would say to you that the Commission's duty under the governance regulation, despite the fact that there was a total lack of ambition really in the overall package, the fact that the Commission had a new legal duty to adopt a long-term strategy for Europe, setting out the policy options for actually getting to net zero in Europe, it kick-started a much more serious focus within the Commission on policy consistency with net zero. It also importantly gave civil society a concrete opportunity. The anticipation of the publication of that strategy gave civil society a much more concrete opportunity to set out their own vision for the policy framework to get to net zero. And the climate community effectively became far more confident at that time in calling for long-term governance, and also became much more confident about their ideas, and they were essentially able to take advantage of the political shift in the European Parliament. And also they were better able to keep the pressure on the European Commission about why it was so important for Europe not only to commit to net zero, but also to create a binding framework to ensure that policy consistency was achieved. So when Ursula von der Leyen announced her intention to propose a European climate law, I think that civil society and probably ECF, certainly the governance programme, were less surprised than perhaps the authors in the collection. I think that we had been very much urging them down that road, and obviously we were only one tiny voice in a huge cacophony, but I think that there was at least a language and a thinking about this, and the ground, the political ground, the policy ground, a lot of work had been done to lay the ground for that. I think then coming into the present, more into the European Green Deal itself, I have been working very closely with the Foundation and its many partners to, I suppose we first of all worked very intensively on the European climate law itself. I don't have time to get into the details of that, but I think it's important to flag three interesting battle lines in that campaign that make me worry about the strength of the Commission's commitment to long-term governance going forward. The first was that the Commission's proposal, and indeed the final legislation that was adopted, the Commission itself, though, did not propose that member states would also have long-term climate targets. And they failed, in a sense, to communicate a sense that delivering the EU's climate neutrality objective would require not only a long-term governance framework in Brussels, but it would also require equivalent frameworks in each country. Also, the Commission's proposal did not include, they did not propose including national long-term strategies in the consistency check that they would do under the legislation. And I think that sent a worrying message to member states about the significance of long-term strategies, which is, I think, a retrograde step. And it's one that we are certainly, I mean, we were able to rectify it in the trilogue process. But I think in terms of the dynamic between national capitals and the Commission about the importance of this long-term approach and policy backcasting against that long-term approach, I think that was worrying. And the third, I think, worrying signal that came out of all of this for me was that the Commission strongly resisted the establishment of the European Climate Advisory Body, despite the fact that every credible national climate law contains that arrangement. They contain this arrangement for independent climate advisory bodies to provide independent expert advice linked to the science, to guide and provide a sort of a sounding board to policymakers. The Commission was not at all receptive to that, and it really was fought right down to the bitter end on that issue. So I think we will certainly watch very closely to see how that body is established and the role it finally engages with. And I would also say that at the same time as the climate law was being negotiated and developed, a separate crucial piece of legislation was also emerging in the background called the Aarhus Regulation. And this is the regulation that contained the rights to allow civil society and members of the public to challenge decision-making by the European institutions. And the Commission has only very, very reluctantly conceded to those rights. And there is a sense I felt in the last year of work that the Commission has resisted the governance arrangements that would ensure that it itself and its co-legislators are held to account for delivering the long-term climate objective. And that does, I think that is a source of concern. I'm also working very closely now with the Foundation and partners to advance our thinking on the Fit for 55 package, and I will kind of end in some concluding comments here. I would say, first of all, that we were disappointed that the Commission's proposals did not reflect or do not reflect a focus on advancing the arrangements for long-term climate governance, either at the EU level or at the national level. They have persisted in proposing short-term national climate targets just out to 2030. They have refused to include the governance regulation in the review process. So there is no opportunity to strengthen the process of climate planning, whether for 2030 or for the longer term at national level, which I think is a crucial issue and was very much an issue that emerged from the Glasgow Compact, the need for those climate plans to be done well. And there was also no proposal from the Commission that it would refresh the Union's long-term strategy for getting to net zero, which I think is an absolutely crucial issue. It's not enough to simply propose that, to publish that strategy and leave it there for once and for all. That should be a living document, continually refreshed to basically continue to demonstrate the commitment. And I think what I would say about the Commission's proposal, and this certainly informs my own thinking about this, is that the Commission's whole approach to the Fit for 55 package has been to expand carbon pricing, but without also strengthening the standard of national climate governance in each country, and particularly the need for long-term governance. Pricing alone is not enough. The transformation required for climate neutrality is societal. It's going to be deeply political and will require profound changes in how people live. This will require political leadership and public consent. And long-term climate governance, we know, plays a crucial role in enabling those outcomes. This reality is already strongly recognized in I think, half of the EU's member states, who have already gone ahead of the Union in committing themselves to net zero and, importantly, to the long-term governance frameworks to get there through their national climate laws. And I think maybe the Commission is calculating that they can just rely on this happening anyway. But I think that's a very high risk strategy, because those national processes occur slowly, they're unpredictable, the quality of the outcome is unpredictable. And in the meantime, pricing alone without a strong national governance framework could lead to a really strong political backlash against the Fit for 55 package and against European climate policy, which could destabilize political leadership just at the moment when it needs to ramp up. And it seems to me that I think the concluding comment I would make is that the Fit for 55 package, in my opinion, is the moment for the EU to apply the lessons, to actually learn the lessons, to absorb the lessons and to apply the lessons that its climate law countries have learned about the importance of long-term climate governance, and that it has kept climate policy going forward in those countries despite the enormous countervailing pressures that they are experiencing now and will continue to do so in the decades ahead. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon, for commenting on the topic as well in some of the articles of this issue. I would start this final discussion with a question that was directed to Diarmuid by Duncan Stewart. He asks you, Diarmuid, to let us know a little bit about European Union fiscal measures to drive the zero carbon transition. So progressive carbon tax, a carbon tax on imports into the European Union. What can you tell us about that?
Sure, thanks, Rodrigo. And before I get to that, just a very quick thank you to Sharon for those really rich insights, and maybe one response that thank you for pointing out those gaps. I think the special issue was extensive rather than being comprehensive, and our claim wasn't that we were telling once and for all the story of the European Green Deal, and so I fully accept those additional perspectives, and it's really great to hear them. And I think also Sharon went some way to answering some of this question that Rodrigo posed to me around fiscal measures, and I would build on Sharon's comments that pricing isn't enough. So pricing, carbon pricing of any kind is part of the policy package, but if we place it front and center, I think we are likely to run into the kinds of trouble that Sharon identified, and I'd agree with her on that. On the specific question of fiscal measures, which is, I understand, the focus of the question, the union's options are constrained by its limited competence on fiscal measures. And so, if we go back 30 years to the early 90s, this battle was fought over a carbon and energy tax at union level, and that was rejected by member states in favor. And the Commission's response then, a decade later, was to propose the European Emissions Trading Scheme. So we have, at union level, member states have various kinds of carbon taxes, but at union level, the EU ETS is the central pricing mechanism. On the question about the carbon tax on imports, this is very much a live issue with the CBAM proposal that's on the table at the moment. My understanding of the effect of this is playing out. My understanding is that Russia's net zero pledge at COP26 was driven, at least in part, by pressure on the Russian government from Russian industry about the about possible future impacts of the EU's carbon border tax. So even the possibility of the proposal, the legislation isn't in place, and we don't know what the final version will look like. But even the possibility of that threat seems to be an important driver in motivating change. And I guess that touches on some of what Joseph was talking about kind of unilateral action on the part of the EU.
Thank you, Diarmuid. Sharon, I'd like to read you a question that we received from Tomae Kakoli Duarte. He asks how the COP26 decisions will shape environmental research going forward at national and at European Union levels.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that certainly within, I certainly hope that in terms of the research agenda that the academic community develops, that what we start to see is a really serious focus amongst the research community in unpacking and really understanding the impacts of national climate laws and understanding the impact of the European climate law, understanding the impact of what is a good long-term strategy, what's a credible long-term strategy, but fundamentally articulating the many different types of benefits that this long-term approach takes. And this can be, I think, it can be issues about what we can see in our own research at the European Climate Foundation, for example, is the impact that it has on shifting the discourse in individual countries, in building cross-party political understanding. And there are many different layers, I think, of understanding. But I also think that there is a need, I think, for research about, I think it's an issue that Mariana Mazzucato is probably very famous for in terms of articulating the concept of the entrepreneurial state, mission-minded state, and why the entrepreneurial state is the most efficient innovator and policy innovator that is available. I think that it would be very helpful for social scientists from law, politics, governance, to look at that analysis and to see to what extent we can start to better design governance mechanisms that mobilize and empower the entrepreneurial state, because this is crucially what is going to be needed going forward.
Thank you, Sharon.
There are several other ideas, but they are certainly two that are pressing on my mind.
And a good hint for the researchers in the audience. Diarmuid, I would go back to you again now with a question from Adam Boland. He asks, how useful do you think it would be for Ireland, and we have a good wide Irish segment in our audience today, how useful do you think it would be for Ireland to undertake another citizens' assembly which is focused specifically on climate change?
Thanks, Rodrigo, and thanks, Adam, for the question. I would wonder about the utility of doing another broad-ranging citizens' assembly on climate change as a whole. You know, I think the counter argument would be, we've already done it. Now, you know, and the climate change was kind of one of 5 topics and on the previous citizens' assembly, and it was, you know, the main focus was on repeal, or the potential repeal of Ireland's restrictive abortion regime. But nonetheless, I think, you know, there are other ways in which a citizens' assembly could be used. For example, so the government has committed to a citizens' assembly on biodiversity. So you know, that's a slightly different topic within the environmental domain. You know, there might be potential for a citizens' assembly on a particularly contentious topic, for example, agriculture and climate change, or to downscale to regional or local level. So I would see those as possible next steps rather than a fully blown national citizens' assembly on climate change in an Irish context.
Okay, Diarmuid, thank you. Thank you for your answer. We are reaching our time. I would perhaps close the webinar with the final question to Sharon, Claire Dupont, our co-editor. She asks, does the requirement under Glasgow Climate Pact to provide updates next year on ambition form a pressure point for the European Union in its policy development, updating strategies?
I think very much yes. And I think it also highlights the error of leaving the governance regulation out of the Fit for 55 package. I think it's absolutely essential that the EU updates its European long-term strategy, and it's already clear that many countries have not done their own national long-term strategies very well. These are the strategies that are required under the European governance regulation. Other partners that I work with are examining those strategies very, very closely. Some countries haven't, I think, submitted any to the European Commission. Some are done very poorly. And there is, if Europe is going to build ambition. If member states are going to deliver the step change, it's absolutely crucial that both the European Commission and all of the national capitals update those long-term strategies as a matter of urgency. And I think that the template in the governance regulation on long-term strategies portrays, it basically communicates the long-term strategy as a Cinderella document instead of the crucial document that it is in reality. And that is, it was flagged in the Paris Agreement. It's now been once again returned to in Glasgow. And I think this is an essential issue, but that must be resolved by the Fit for 55 process.
Thank you, Sharon, for your answer. We have reached our time. I will now conclude this webinar with two concluding notes. The first one, so the thematic issue in which this event was based is available on Politics and Governance website. As always, open access. You can access, read, cite, share anytime, anywhere where you are. The second note is this webinar was recorded and will soon be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Both the audiences who were here and the absentees will receive the notification once the video is on, also to access and share as long as you want. I would like to thank our speakers today, Diarmuid, and to also Claire for helping us bring up this webinar, Sharon for your commenting remarks on the webinar, and of course, Joseph and Jana for presenting the research. This is the main goal of our webinars. I would like also to thank our attendees for their questions, their engagement. I'll see you all in Politics and Governance's next webinar. Thank you.